I think things that you wrote some books around here. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's so fascinating. We love to talk about these things.
Oh, really? I do.
I wish the world knew that Las Vegas was not the first Las Vegas.
No.
What was?
Newport.
Yeah, Newport what?
Newport was Vegas before Vegas was cool.
Let's talk about something. Newport, Kentucky.
Yes.
Okay.
Newport, Kentucky.
So share some of these things with us, because I don't know why we like the mob lifestyle. I don't know why, but we love it.
It is. It's romantic. You know, it's been romanticized, and there's a certain cachet or attraction for the whole thing of crime, but the way they lived, the things they did, the whole secrecy, the omerta, the what we called the silent syndicate was the Cleveland mob. So the short story, and I'll try and condense this and jump in with questions whenever you want.
So let's the first question be this when you talk about it. What book? Is it The Forbidden Fruit? Is that really so? It's sitting here. It's the Sin City's Underworld and the Supper Club Inferno, which we can talk about, Beverly Hills and all that.
Correct.
But is a lot of it in this book, The Forbidden Fruit?
It is. This is where the story starts. And then I pick it up in my second book, Not in Our Town, which takes the story. This one runs from 1930s to 1977 at the Supper Club fire. Okay. The next one picks it up in the 50s on the Cincinnati side of the river and says, okay, what was going on with the mob there? And that takes you up to the 1990s.
Okay, so I interrupted you. You were talking about the Silent Syndicate, Cleveland, and the evolution here. And
so what happened is there really was no national Cosa Nostra mob, organized crime, whatever you want to call it. There were no syndicates outside of the East Coast until Prohibition came along. And when the government took away people's booze, even in the middle of a depression, think about that. You have no job, can't put food on the table, people can't even have fun. And the government took all that away, and the mob said, hey, we can supply that. There's our business model. And they went fast coast to coast. And one of the people that was the biggest in that whole network of bootlegging was George Remus in Cincinnati. He was not only the bootleg king, he was the bootleg king of America. He sold more bootleg liquor than anybody in the whole country.
We have a Remus bottle of bourbon over here.
All right.
I think we do. So anyway, yeah. So I know that name. Do you think people nationally know that name? I don't think they do.
A little bit.
Okay.
If people watched a show that was called Boardwalk Empire, there was a character in there, George Remus. And but nationally, no. The Midwest is overlooked because everybody is is East Coast centric and West Coast centric. So we hear a ton about the East Coast mob with the Godfather movies and all that. But I'll tell you, those East Coast crime families were very much a presence in Newport, too. So George Remus set up his crime empire in Newport, and when he went to prison, his gang took over and opened gambling clubs. So it's a very clear progression for what the mob did. They start out with bootleg liquor, and then when Prohibition is repealed, they immediately move into gambling. Because now you've got casinos, which now you serve the liquor, you got the gambling, and then gambling leads to prostitution. So they've got gambling, prostitution. There's the next thing. And gradually, this builds this empire in Newport that was incredible. So in 1970, around the late 60s, the FBI said that Newport, Kentucky, had a bigger handle, which is the take, on all its rackets than Las Vegas. And the take in Las Vegas in those years was $3 billion. So what they're saying is that Newport had a take on illegal rackets that was bigger than the combined tax revenue of Ohio and Kentucky together. It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, they were the national capital of layoff betting. They had phone banks all over the place in basements. They had people taking bets. They had a guy named the Wizard of Odds who was so good at calculating odds that the NFL hired him to flag crooked games. So
out of Newport, Kentucky.
Yeah, all this is happening in Newport. There were gambling clubs everywhere. There were casinos. Carpet joints were the nice ones. Bust-out joints were the tacky ones where you left busted. That's why they called it that, one way or another.
Mm-hmm. So that's 1970.
Yeah, so this is all leading up. In the 1960s, a reporter came up from Louisville, and he counted 300 prostitutes in 1 mile on Monmouth Street. Yeah. So that's how wild it was. It was so busy, they had day streets and night streets for the brothels, for all the traffic that was coming in. And this went on all the way through the 60s all the way through the 50s, up until about 1960, when Jack Kennedy got elected, appointed his brother as the new Attorney General. And there was this amazing scandal in Newport where a guy named George Ratterman ran for sheriff on the cleanup ticket. And the mob filled him full of chloral hydrate knockout drops and framed him in bed with a dancer. We could put dancer in air quotes. Her name was April Flowers.
What do you know?
Yeah. Her real name was Juanita Hodges, but April Flowers was her stage name. And so they hauled the sheriff. They haul him out of bed with this hooker dancer, and his career as sheriff is ended, right? Well, not quite. He had his blood tested. It showed the chloral hydrate. The whole thing blew up in headlines that went around the world. Even in Tokyo, they were writing about this story. And George Ratterman basically won the office of sheriff after the mob was cleaned out by Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy saw what happened to George Ratterman and said, I'm sending my guys. And he gave him a blank check to come down to Newport. And that's where he initiated his war on the mob. Now, this is where the whole thing took a really interesting detour, because research on books is like going down a door or hallway of doors. And each door you open leads to another hallway of doors. And suddenly this hallway opens up, and it's the whole Kennedy assassination. So I made a request through FOIA for the Freedom of Information Act, and I went to the FBI vault and plugged in keywords, and I hit the combination right. And they sent me 3 CDs of illegal wiretaps and information about the mob. And in these illegal wiretaps that were done by Bobby Kennedy, they were tapping into a room at the Desert Inn, which was run by one of the big mobsters.
In Vegas.
Yep. And they're discussing killing the Kennedys. And that led to other places. But anyway, circle back to Newport. Bobby Kennedy declares war on the mob in Newport, Kentucky. A few years later, his brother is killed. A 1979 investigation totally debunked the Warren Commission and proved almost beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was the mob who killed Jack Kennedy. And that they're thinking on that in those tapes that I had, that I still have. The transcripts say that they're saying that they wanted to kill Bobby. And somebody pointed out, no, if you kill Bobby, Jack will come at us with everything he's got. We go after Jack. And so you have all of these connections in our local history that were just astounding to me. I had no idea how big the mob was, that it was run by the Cleveland Syndicate, that they also had pieces of the action that were given off to the New York families, to Chicago, to keep the peace. It was big, big, big time. But after the Ratterman blow up, after Bobby Kennedy cleaned them out, the big mobsters all went to Las Vegas. In fact, there were so many people leaving Newport for Las Vegas at that time. The flights to Vegas were nicknamed Syndicate Airlines.
Wow.
And it was just an incredible time.
Wow. So on that JFK thing, that's fascinating to everyone. Who was the guy in New Orleans? Who was the mob connected
Marcello.
guy? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Carlos Marcello.
Yep.
He and Santo Trafficante in Tampa, and Sam Giancana in Chicago. Those were the 3. And they were also deeply involved with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Pension Fund. And Hoffa was absolutely desperate to kill Kennedy. He hated the guy. Kennedy was prosecuting him and made his life miserable, put him in prison. And Hoffa swore he would kill Kennedy. And when Jack was killed, he wanted to kill Bobby, but when Jack was killed, he danced on a table, according to the stories.
So why? What happened with Bobby?
That's a curious thing, too. The more you look into that, the more the official version really doesn't stand up. I was always pretty much agnostic on these things. I'd read some books about the Kennedys, and I kind of thought there was a lot of questions about Jack Kennedy. You know, even today, 70% of the people do not believe Oswald was a lone gunman in America. You can conduct that poll anytime. And even today, the CIA and the White House and the FBI are still blocking release of the Kennedy papers.
Aren't they supposed to be out in December now or something? Isn't that supposed to happen?
Oh, my gosh. They were supposed to be out about 20 years ago.
So here's my question about that. I'm sure you have an opinion because you know way more than I have. You can have a little bit of understanding about some of it, but not what you do. Why is it not okay for us to know?
Oh, well, that's a good question.
Why is it not okay?
This is the kind of thing, when you learn this stuff, it really destroys any confidence in our government, such as institutions like the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was completely compromised by the mob. Yep. He had a homosexual lifestyle with his chief assistant, and those two carried on and dressed up, put on dresses. This is back in the days when this was considered blackmailable. Yep. Today, probably not so much.
Nope.
I mean, things have changed
Might
a lot.
be championed now.
Yeah.
Yep.
But in those days, and the FBI had pictures. Yep. They had complete control over him. He liked to go to the racetracks and bet the ponies, and he always did so with mob advice in the company of mobsters at the track. So
much so that he didn't even acknowledge the mob, right?
No, he pretended there was no such thing until Bobby Kennedy forced him to admit there was such a thing as the mob.
On that commission.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then he directly interfered with the Warren Commission and covered up evidence and basically trash can memos that pointed to connections between Lee Harvey Oswald and Carlos Marcello.
Yeah.
It's just shameful. And it's amazing that this chapter in our history has been so completely fogged over that people today really have no idea what happened.
I'd love to. I mean, we love conspiracies
yes.
But it'd just be good just to know.
Yeah.
Let's just know and put it to bed.
Yeah, why not? Why not?
Yes.
Why is it that the CIA and the White House, in this latest effort to release these papers, once again withheld them? And you know what their excuse was? National security. What possible national security issues could we have?
They're dead. Everyone's dead.
Everybody's dead.
Yeah.
They're gone.
And the dumb shit the CIA and the FBI is doing now, it's way worse the things they're doing now compared to what they were doing back then.
Yeah.
So come on. I mean, we already think they're doing this stuff and they did it. So let's just get through it here.
Yeah.
Come on, just put it out.
I mean, what national security interest is there other than protecting the tarnished reputation of both the FBI and the CIA?
That's it.
Yeah.
So I guess we have to get it out in the public on how bad they both really are. The reasons and purposes for them are good, right? The origin,
right.
I guess, right?
Absolutely.
Just go ahead and just admit that you're just as bad as we think you are and then get to improving it. But it's fascinating.
Well, if you read history, there was a group called the Praetorian Guard in Rome, and they were the Secret Service of the day, the elite top Roman soldiers, and they were assigned to guard the emperor and protect his life. Well, they soon figured out that nobody was closer to the emperor, and if they didn't like an emperor, they would take his life. They would basically murder him, and then they had control over who would be the next emperor. And today, you look at these agencies like the FBI and the CIA, and it's hard not to draw a direct parallel to the Praetorian Guard.
Am I supposed to say that's scary?
It is very scary. The secrets that they withheld from us, in a way, I've always been somewhat, well, you have to be somewhat of a cynic to be in the news business. You disbelieve until you can prove, always check things out. I really didn't even scratch the surface of how corrupt and dishonest our federal institutions like the FBI and the CIA were until I got into these books. In this first book, it was the fact that I'd always heard about the Supper Club fire, and I was curious about it, and I'd done just enough reporting on it to know that there were a lot of questions about whether or not that was an accident or was it intentional. And I said, well, hey, why not research the heck out of it and see what I can find out? And first thing I found out, which surprised me, was that the first fire was in the 1930s. And it all started then. That's when the mob moved in, and they took over the club and told them, hey, we'll buy you out or we'll burn you out, an offer you can't refuse. Well, the owner refused, and they burned it out.
1977. But that was in the 30s the first time.
The first time in the 30s, a little 5-year-old girl was killed. She was staying there with her sister and the caretaker, and that was the first death on that hilltop in Southgate. And then that same club gradually became the Beverly Hills Supper Club later on in the 1970s when the Schilling family bought it. And then there was another fire. Midway through their remodeling, the place was burned again, and again it was arson. No question about it. The evidence is all there. And then in 1977, you look at this amazing case where 165 people were killed, the biggest, if it is indeed intentional arson, that's the biggest mass murder in the history of our region, and one of the biggest in the history of our nation. And so it's a cold case like no other. And the evidence that began to pile up as I interviewed people who were first-person witnesses that were working there that night or who knew the family and worked at the supper club was Really compelling. Unbelievable stuff.
They're building on that site now.
Yes. Yeah, in my own opinion, it's probably time to let it go. And they're doing a memorial for the people who are lost, which is really nicer than what was there, which was a tangle of honeysuckle with some homemade signs that were put up by one of the people who survived the fire, who was really a hero that night. And so really, I mean, it was kind of a spooky place where people would go up and drink, and maybe sometimes they'd stay overnight and do some weird stuff up there trying to find out if there were spirits and ghosts. And there's a chapter about that too.
Wow. All in The Forbidden Fruit.
Yes.
And that is the first book.
Yes.
Okay. And then the second one is, again...
Not in Our Town.
Okay.
The Queen City versus the King of Smut.
Okay.
And
who's the King of Smut?
Larry Flint. There were so many surprises when I got into that book because, I mean, the way this worked is in the 70s, if you remember, you're probably too young to remember, but in the 70s, almost every city had what was called a sin strip, a tacky neighborhood where there were topless bars and massage parlors and X-rated movies and adult bookstores. All of that crap was all kind of pushed into one bad neighborhood, and it just got worse and worse with all the crime it drew. So, but Cincinnati didn't have one. Cincinnati never had a sin strip. So why is that? Well, part of it is that we had our adult playground right across the bridge in Newport, which was one of the biggest in the country. So really you look at that and you go, oh, Cincinnati has this ivory clean reputation as a family-friendly town where you can raise your kids and all this. But what was really the story? Well, the mob was trying to push into Cincinnati during those years and right up through the 70s. And the face of that mob was none other than Larry Flint. And he was connected. And he was bankrolled and connected to the Cleveland mob.
That's the first time I've ever heard that story. So even guys like me that care about our history, we need to read the book.
Well, I was in a newsroom for 20 years in Cincinnati, and so many things that came up, I couldn't believe it. I was really surprised.
I've never heard that.
Yeah. Wow. I'd often heard rumors. Okay. In fact, he was prosecuted in his first case where he went to jail in Cincinnati for obscenity and organized crime.
Oh.
And nobody believed it. They all said, "Oh, the Siles, the prosecutor,
they're tacking it on top."
Yeah,
and,
just piling on. Yeah. And so I started checking it out, and sure enough, I found the connections. And he was basically had bankrupted 11 bars in Dayton. He was not a successful businessman as he always pretended. He was a failure. And suddenly he starts opening these hustler clubs in Columbus and Dayton and Cincinnati. Well, he had almost $1 million loan from the Cleveland mob.
Washing the money through it, probably.
And in those days, according to the FBI and numerous sources, 95% of all the adult industry was owned and run by the mob. 95%.
I mean, that's the industry.
That was the whole industry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And they probably didn't know about the other 5%, or else they would have pushed them out or taken over the business.
A lot of those 5% were killed.
Right.
Or beaten.
So what's this, as we wrap this up, what's the Silent Mafia in Cleveland? Tell us something about that.
Silent Syndicate?
Is that Silent Syndicate? Sorry. Yeah.
Sure. The Silent Syndicate it was called the Cleveland Four, and it was led by a guy named Mo Dalitz. And Mo Dalitz was the big crime boss. Now, you go back to the 20s, and they had a national convention of mafiosos, of organized crime figures. And they all got together because Capone was causing so many headlines with his massacres, the Valentine's Day and the gang wars. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to put a lid on that because it was drawing too much heat. So they got together and they divided the country into basically franchises. And the Cleveland mob got Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky. So Mo is running the Cleveland mob out of northeastern Ohio, of course. And he came up through the Purple Gang in Detroit, which was among the most vicious and ruthless criminal organizations in the country. So Pete Schmidt opens this club in Newport, and Mo came down to see it, and it was so beautiful. We've got a picture of it as it looked in the 1930s, and it's spectacular. And it was so beautiful, he said, I've got to have this place. And that's when the Cleveland mob moved into Newport in northern Kentucky and really took over. And then they set up their empire. And as they went on, they had even people like Frank Costello from the New York crime families. He had a piece of the action. The Levinson brothers from Chicago had a piece of the action. And you have all these colorful characters like Red Masterson, the hitman who admitted killing more than 100 people. He worked for the Cleveland mob. You had Charles Lester, the spider in the middle of the web. He was the mouthpiece, the mob attorney who engineered everything in northern Kentucky. You had Big Porky and Little Porky. You had all
Those
these...
are some good names. However those happened, right? It's like, come on, guys, you don't want those.
Yeah, they were just
awesome.
Amazing people.
So for anybody who really had some interest or curiosity around Newport, the mob, and where it spiders out across the country, this book gives it to you.
Yes, and then if you want to find out what happened in Ohio, it spidered into Ohio. There's chapters in there about all of the cities in Ohio and how they were under these various area codes of mob control. Mm-hmm. So Toledo had its own control, Akron, Youngstown, another mob, Cleveland, Columbus had a different mob, Cincinnati was under control of the Cleveland Syndicate through Newport.
Wow.
And there was some amazing corruption. And it's just a fascinating story of what's going on.